We've now travelled from the beautiful beaches of Dorset to the world famous beaches of London, because we wanted to show you a slightly different type of photography, and because this as a location we felt was perfect for teaching you our next tip, which is using aperture priority mode and exposure compensation.
Yeah, aperture priority mode is a semi-automatic mode. We control the aperture and the camera controls the exposure. And if we can control the aperture, we control the look of the photograph.
The aperture is the size of the opening within the lens. A low aperture number, which can also be called the f-stop, such as 2.8 or 4, let's say, corresponds to a large opening in the lens. As you increase the aperture number, or the f-stop number, to let's say 5.6, 8, 10, 13, 16, 22, the aperture is getting smaller.
Yeah, and how does that affect the look of the photograph? Well, when you're on about f2.8, f4, obviously a low aperture number, you get a very shallow depth of field. This is great for things like portraits, when you just want the eyes in focus and it renders the background out of focus. And when you're shooting things like a more wide angle shots, maybe you're photographing a landscape, when you want the reeds in the foreground, you want the lake in the middle of the photograph, and then the mountains in the background all in focus, then you would use a high aperture number, something like what, f11, f16, something like that.
So to illustrate this point to you, we're going to quickly show you 3 photos. This is a photo we took of St Paul's, shot on f4. As you can see, there's lots of out of focus in the image. This version of it is exactly the same shot, but shot at f10, and you can see there's a bit more in focus, and now this version is shot on f22, and you'll see that there's much more in focus. So it's really important to pick an aperture that is appropriate for how you want the photo to look and the style of the image.
Okay, the last thing is exposure compensation. And the good thing about aperture priority is that the camera sorts out the exposure for us, and most of the time it actually gets it right, which is why we recommend it. But there are times when it doesn't quite get the look that we're looking for. So that's when we use the dial, which has a plus and minus on it. And if you go to the minus side, you get a darker photo than what the camera thinks. And if you go to the plus side, you get a brighter photo than what the camera thinks. And that actually makes it really, really intuitive and quick to use.
It'll make a really big difference to your photography instantly if you start playing around with this exposure compensation button. Try taking the same shot on 0, +1, +2, -1 and -2, and you'll see a difference in the images, and then you can start to use it creatively. So, to show you exactly what we mean, we are going to take some shots of St Paul's. We're going to do some using higher aperture numbers and some using lower aperture numbers to show you when you might want to use each of those values, and we're also going to play around a bit with exposure compensation so you can see the difference for yourselves. Let's do it.
Let's go, let's go, let's go.
So I wasn't expecting to do sort of wildlife photography in central London, but there are some people who are feeding the swans and the pigeons. So I thought, what better subject to show you shallow depth of field, focusing on the birds in the foreground, and then with St Paul's out of focus behind. So to make this look the way I want it to look, aperture priority mode, low aperture, and that's going to give me the shot I'm looking for. It's quite fun.
So Matt has demonstrated how to use a shallow aperture creatively, photographing those dirty pigeons. Now it is my turn. I've got a landscape sort of shot here. So I've got St. Paul's in the background and I have these leading lines of these steps, and I want the whole thing to be in focus. And by using a higher aperture of about 11, I think I've got 11 here, I can then enable the steps to be in focus as well as St. Paul's in the background. I'm also going as far as I can left to try and get a bit of a reflection as well, so that'll look cool. And that's what's so good about aperture priority, is that you can quickly just flick with your finger. It can go on 2.8 really quickly, and then you can go to f11 just in a matter of milliseconds. So let me just take this shot. And because I'm on aperture priority mode, I've got my aperture on f11, so everything is in focus. Yeah, pretty happy with that.
In the tip at the start of the video, we mentioned exposure compensation, and I've got a really good example here of when you might end up using it. The first shot I took, with the camera sort of coming up with the exposure itself, it came out too bright, particularly all the highlights. They were way too light. So I've used exposure compensation. I've put it towards minus. I've gone to minus 1.3. I've taken the shot again, and the highlights are now really well exposed. The shadows have gone really deep, and it's a much more interesting, dramatic image. So do have a play around with exposure compensation. And this is such an easy sort of exercise to do, what we've just done. Go out, take the same photo on different apertures, and then also just look for opportunities to photograph using a high aperture, where you need your foreground and background in focus, and low apertures, where you just want to focus on one subject and have everything going out of focus in the background.